The carriage wheels stopped outside the servant gate, not the front entrance, and Duke Edmund Halden felt his heart pound harder than it ever had before any battle or business deal. He pulled the rough wool jacket tighter around his shoulders and stepped down into the mud, holding a borrowed name like a stone in his mouth. Tonight, he was not a duke. Tonight he was Edmund Carow, a footman hired on short notice for Bennet Manor, and if anyone discovered the truth before he was ready, everything he had planned would fall apart in an instant. He had made this decision 3 days earlier, sitting alone in his study, with a letter from Lord Bennet spread across his desk. The letter spoke of a marriage between Edmund and Lady Clara Bennet, arranged with the same cold precision as a business contract. Land, money, and family names had been discussed at length, but nowhere in the letter was there a single word about Clara herself. What did she want? What did she fear? What kind of man did she hope to marry? Edmund had asked himself these questions late into the night, and he had grown tired of meeting young women who smiled at him only because of his title, who agreed with everything he said and revealed nothing real about themselves. He did not want another polished performance. He wanted the truth, even if the truth was difficult to hear. So he had gone to his valet, Peter, a quiet man who had served him since childhood, and who Edmund trusted completely. Peter had argued against the plan at first, warning him that dukes did not sneak into other men's houses pretending to be servants, that if he were discovered, the scandal could ruin both families. But Edmund had made up his mind, and in the end, Peter agreed to help, arranging for Edmund to be hired as a temporary footman through a contact who owed him a favor. Nobody at Bennet Manor would know who he truly was. Nobody except Peter, who remained behind at the inn in the village, ready if Edmund needed him. Now, standing in the dark courtyard with rain threatening in the clouds above, Edmund wondered if this had been a foolish idea. A tall man with gray whiskers and sharp eyes approached him, introducing himself as Mr. Foley, the butler of Bennet Manor. Foley looked him over the way a merchant examines a horse before purchase, checking his hands, his posture, the state of his boots. "You will follow every instruction without question," Foley said, his voice flat and businesslike. "You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not look directly at Lord Bennet or Lady Clara unless required by your duties. Do you understand?" Edmund nodded, swallowing the instinct to correct the man, to remind him that dukes were rarely spoken to this way. Instead he said, "Yes, sir," in a voice as humble as he could manage, and followed Foley through a narrow door into the servants' hall. The kitchen was warm and loud, filled with the clatter of pots and the sharp orders of a stout cook named Mrs. Higgins, who barely glanced at him before pointing toward a stack of firewood that needed carrying. Edmund picked up the logs without complaint, though his arms, more accustomed to holding a pen or a sword than heavy timber, ached within minutes. Around him, other servants moved with practiced speed, weaving between each other in the tight space, without ever colliding, exchanging quiet jokes and warnings about which rooms needed attention before the evening meal. He caught fragments of conversation as he worked. Someone mentioned that the young mistress had been unusually quiet all day. Someone else laughed and said it was because the real Duke was expected any day now, and everyone in the house was nervous about making a good impression. Edmund kept his head down and listened carefully, storing every detail away. It was nearly 2 hours before he saw her. Lady Clara Bennet walked into the main hallway, just as Edmund was carrying a tray of polished silver toward the dining room. She wore a simple green dress, her dark hair pinned loosely, and she moved with none of the practiced elegance Edmund expected from a woman about to be presented to a duke. Instead, she walked briskly, almost impatiently, as though she had somewhere more important to be. When she passed a young maid struggling to carry a stack of linens, Clara stopped without hesitation and took half the pile from her arms, walking beside her the rest of the way and talking to her as though they were equals. Edmund nearly dropped the tray in his surprise. He had expected many things from his future bride. Beauty, certainly, for the letters had mentioned that much. Perhaps intelligence, perhaps charm suited for society gatherings. He had not expected kindness that showed itself only when she believed no one important was watching. He had not expected a woman who noticed the people everyone else ignored. That night, lying on a narrow cot in the servants' quarters, listening to the soft breathing of 2 other footmen sleeping nearby, Edmund found himself thinking, not about land agreements or family alliances, but about the way Clara had smiled at the maid, easy and unguarded, He told himself it meant nothing, that one moment of kindness did not reveal a person's true character. But sleep came slowly, and when it finally did, his dreams were filled with green dresses and quiet laughter. The next morning brought new tasks and new dangers. Edmund learned quickly that being a footman meant being invisible, present in every room, yet expected to remain unnoticed. And this suited his purpose perfectly. He carried breakfast trays, opened doors, and stood silently near walls while important conversations took place around him, as though servants had no ears at all. It was during one of these silent moments, standing near the drawing room entrance with a jug of water in his hands, that he first heard Lord Bennet speak about the marriage. "The Duke will make an excellent match for our family," Lord Bennet was saying to his wife, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had secured exactly what he wanted. "Clara will understand her duty when the time comes. She always does, eventually." Lady Bennet's response was quieter, harder for Edmund to hear, but he caught enough to understand that she shared her husband's confidence, treating their daughter's future as a matter already settled, a conclusion rather than a choice. Edmund felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. He thought of his own parents, long past, who had chosen each other freely, against the wishes of both families, and had spoken often of how rare and precious that freedom had been. He wondered if Clara knew what her parents truly thought, or if she still believed, as young people sometimes did, that her feelings mattered as much as her duty. He did not have to wonder for long. Later that afternoon, while delivering a message to the garden, Edmund spotted Clara sitting alone on a stone bench beneath an old oak tree, a book open on her lap, though her eyes were fixed somewhere far beyond the pages. She looked younger in that moment, and more troubled than she had appeared the previous evening. Edmund slowed his steps without meaning to, watching her from a respectful distance, until she suddenly looked up and caught him staring. For a moment, panic gripped him. Had she recognized something in his face, some hint that he was not who he claimed to be? But her expression held only mild curiosity, the kind any young lady might show toward an unfamiliar servant. "You are new here," she said, not unkindly. "Yes, my lady," Edmund answered, bowing his head slightly. Grateful, his voice remained steady. "Hired only yesterday." Clara studied him a moment longer, then returned her attention to her book, though Edmund noticed she still had not turned a single page. He wanted to say something more, to ask what troubled her, but a footman had no right to ask such questions, and so he continued on his way, the message still clutched in his hand, his mind buzzing with everything he had seen and heard. By evening, word had spread through the servants' hall that the Duke's arrival had been confirmed for later in the week, and the entire household buzzed with preparation. Floors were scrubbed until they gleamed, silver was polished twice over, and Mrs. Higgins planned menus with the intensity of a general preparing for battle. Edmund worked alongside the others, carrying, cleaning, arranging, all the while feeling the strange weight of preparing a household to welcome a version of himself that did not yet exist in this house. A formal, distant duke who would arrive with all the pomp and ceremony that his current disguise entirely lacked. That night, unable to sleep, Edmund slipped quietly out to the garden, needing air and space to think. He had not expected the disguise to affect him this deeply, had not expected to feel such a strong pull toward a woman he had only glimpsed and briefly spoken with. But something about Clara's honesty, her kindness toward those below her, her quiet unhappiness beneath a controlled exterior, had already begun to change the shape of his expectations. He did not yet know that within 2 nights, hidden in shadow with a bottle of wine in his hands, he would overhear words that would shake him far more deeply than anything he had felt so far, words that would force him to question not only his plan, but everything he believed about duty, marriage, and the woman he had been sent to observe from a careful, respectful distance. For now, he returned to his narrow cot, closed his eyes, and waited for morning, unaware that the greatest test of his disguise, and of his heart, was still to come. The days that followed tested Edmund in ways he had never imagined. Life below stairs was nothing like the stories he had heard as a boy, stories that made servants seem like background figures in a grand painting, present but unimportant. Instead, Edmund discovered a world with its own rules, its own hierarchy, and its own quiet dramas that unfolded far from the notice of the family upstairs. He learned that Mrs. Higgins, despite her sharp tongue, kept a jar of sweets hidden behind the flour sacks for the youngest kitchen boy, a child of perhaps 10 years, who had lost his parents to fever the previous winter. He learned that Foley, stern as he appeared, had once been dismissed from an earlier position for defending a maid against a guest who had treated her unkindly, and had never spoken of the incident since, though the other servants whispered about it with quiet respect. He learned that beneath the surface of obedience and silence, there existed real loyalty, real friendship, and real suffering, none of which had ever crossed his mind when he thought of servants as simply people who performed tasks. More than anything, he learned to watch Clara. It became, without his fully intending it, the center of his days. He noticed the small things first, the way she greeted every servant by name, even the newest stable boy, who had been hired only a week before Edmund arrived. He noticed that she often skipped the elaborate breakfast prepared for the family, and instead ate simply, sometimes standing in the kitchen doorway speaking with Mrs. Higgins about recipes, asking questions with genuine curiosity, rather than polite disinterest. He noticed that she read constantly, carrying books from room to room, and that her favorite spot for reading was the same stone bench beneath the oak tree where he had first spoken with her. One afternoon, while polishing the brass fixtures along the main staircase, Edmund overheard two housemaids discussing Clara in hushed voices. "She used to laugh so much more," one of them said, a young woman named Louisa who worked closely with Clara as her personal maid, before her mother started pushing this marriage business so hard. "Now she barely smiles unless she thinks no one important is watching." "Can you blame her?" the other maid replied. "A duke she has never met, chosen for her like a new dress. What if he turns out cold, or cruel, or only interested in her family's land?" Edmund's hands stilled on the brass railing. He wanted desperately to correct them, to tell them that he was not cold or cruel, that he genuinely wished to know Clara as a person rather than simply claim her as a bride. But of course he could say nothing, could do nothing but continue polishing the railing, while his chest tightened with an uncomfortable mixture of guilt and determination. That evening, an unexpected visitor arrived at Bennet Manor. Lord Grayson Vale, a neighboring landowner known throughout the county for his charm and his ambition, appeared at the front door claiming a friendly visit to Lord Bennet, though the servants exchanged knowing glances the moment his name was announced. Edmund, standing near the entrance hall with a tray of refreshments, watched as Grayson greeted Lord Bennet warmly, then turned his attention immediately toward Clara, who had just descended the staircase. "Lady Clara," Grayson said, taking her hand and bowing over it with practiced elegance, "you grow more lovely each time I see you. I confess I had hoped to find you free this evening for a walk in the gardens." Clara's smile, Edmund noticed, did not reach her eyes. "I am afraid the gardens will have to wait, Lord Grayson. I have letters to write before supper." Grayson's expression flickered with something sharp and displeased, quickly hidden beneath a smooth laugh. Of course, another time then." As Grayson turned to speak with Lord Bennet about matters of business, Edmund caught something in the man's eyes that troubled him deeply, a calculating coldness that did not match his friendly words. Later, while clearing empty glasses from the drawing room after the guests had departed, Edmund overheard Lord Bennet and his wife discussing Grayson in low voices. "He has asked about Clara 3 times this month alone," Lord Bennet muttered, clearly irritated. "If the Duke's arrangement falls through for any reason, Grayson will not hesitate to press his own suit, and given his family's recent financial troubles, I suspect his interest has less to do with affection and more to do with securing our land." Lady Bennet sighed heavily. "Then let us hope the Duke's visit proceeds smoothly, and that Clara does nothing foolish to jeopardize it." Edmund left the room with the empty glasses rattling slightly on his tray, his mind spinning with new information. Grayson Vale wanted Clara, or at least wanted what marrying Clara would bring him, and if the arrangement with the Duke failed, Clara might find herself pushed toward a man whose intentions were far less honorable than her parents realized. The thought disturbed Edmund more than he expected, and he found himself watching Grayson's future visits with growing suspicion. 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and quiet observation. Edmund grew more skilled at his footman duties, learning to move silently through the house, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to blend so completely into the background that conversations continued around him as though he did not exist. This skill, born of necessity, gave him access to countless small moments that revealed the true character of the household, moments no duke arriving in full ceremony would ever witness. He watched Clara comfort a young maid who had broken a valuable vase, quietly promising to explain the accident to her mother in a way that would not result in the girl's dismissal. He watched her sneak extra bread to a family of tenant farmers who visited the kitchen door, speaking with them about their harvest with real interest, rather than distant charity. He watched her practice her needlework with visible frustration, muttering to herself about how she preferred riding horses to embroidering flowers, a small rebellion against the expectations placed upon her. Each observation deepened Edmund's admiration, and each observation also deepened his guilt. He was watching a woman reveal her true self to a world that believed she was alone, unaware that a stranger in servant's clothing was memorizing every gesture, every word, every flash of hidden feeling. It felt, at times, like a betrayal of the very honesty he claimed to seek. On the fourth evening of his disguise, Edmund was assigned to deliver wine to the private sitting room where Lady Clara often retired after supper to read or write letters before bed. Foley handed him the tray with strict instructions to knock quietly, enter, place the wine on the side table, and leave without disturbing whatever conversation might be taking place, as Lady Clara's aunt, a sharp-witted widow named Margaret, was visiting for several days and often joined her niece for evening conversation. Edmund carried the tray down the quiet hallway, his footsteps soft against the carpet, his mind still turning over everything he had learned about Grayson Vale's intentions and the pressure building around Clara's upcoming marriage. He had no way of knowing that the conversation taking place behind that closed door would change everything he thought he understood about his future bride, about the marriage he had arranged from a distance, and about his own role in a plan that suddenly felt far more complicated than he had ever intended. He raised his hand to knock, then paused, hearing his own name spoken from within, not his true name, but the title that belonged to him, the Duke. His hand froze in the air, and against every rule of his disguise, against every instinct of proper servant behavior, Edmund found himself leaning closer to the door, unable to stop himself from listening to what Clara was about to say. Aunt Margaret's voice came first, gentle but probing, the voice of a woman who had lived long enough to see through polite silences. "You have not mentioned the Duke once since I arrived, Clara. Most young women in your position would speak of little else." There was a pause before Clara answered, and when she did, her voice carried a weariness that surprised Edmund, a tiredness that seemed far too heavy for someone her age. "What is there to say, Aunt Margaret? I have never met the man. I know nothing of him beyond his title and his land. I am told he is considered handsome, and reasonably respected among his peers, but none of that tells me whether he is kind, or whether he will care what I think about anything at all." Edmund stood frozen outside the door, the tray trembling slightly in his hands. He forced himself to hold it steady, terrified the clinking of glass might reveal his presence. "Many marriages begin this way," Margaret said carefully. "Your own mother barely knew your father before their wedding, and they have built a life together regardless." "Have they built a life together?" Clara replied, her voice sharper now. "Or has mother simply learned to disappear so completely into what father wants that no one remembers she ever had opinions of her own? I love my mother, Aunt Margaret, but I have watched her spend 20 years shrinking herself smaller and smaller, until there is barely anything left that belongs only to her. I do not want that. I would rather remain unmarried and unhappy in my own way, than married and unhappy in someone else's shadow." Edmund's chest tightened painfully. He thought of his own mother's laughter, his father's genuine delight in her opinions, the marriage he had always believed was the natural way of things, and he realized with sudden clarity how rare that kind of partnership truly was. How many young women faced the exact fear Clara was now describing. Margaret's voice softened. "And what would you want instead, if you could choose freely?" There was a long silence, long enough that Edmund wondered if Clara would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, as though she were admitting something even to herself for the first time. "I would want a man who asked my opinion and actually listened to the answer," she said. "Not someone who nods politely while already deciding for himself. I would want someone who noticed when I was troubled, even if I tried to hide it. Someone who cared, whether I read novels or studied horses, or preferred silence to conversation." I would want to be seen, Aunt Margaret, not simply owned. Is that so much to ask? It is not too much to ask, Margaret said gently, though it may be difficult to find. Then perhaps I am destined for difficulty, Clara replied, and Edmund heard something in her voice that sounded dangerously close to tears, quickly swallowed and hidden away. Because I do not believe the Duke, sitting comfortably in his grand house with his grand title, has spent even a single moment wondering what kind of woman I am beneath the arrangements my father has made. To him, I suspect, I am simply a suitable match, a name on a paper, a way of securing land and connections, and I am expected to feel grateful for the honor. Edmund could bear it no longer. He set the tray down as quietly as possible on a small table in the hallway, his hands unsteady, his mind racing through every assumption he had carried into this house. He had told himself he wanted to know the real Clara before committing to marriage, had told himself this made him different from other men in his position. But had he truly considered her feelings, her fears, her hopes for the kind of partnership she desired? Or had he simply wanted reassurance that she would be pleasant company, attractive and agreeable, without ever imagining the depth of thought and worry she carried within her? The truth struck him with uncomfortable force. He had approached this entire arrangement much like his own father had approached his mother's hand, except his father, at least, had chosen freely, had pursued genuine affection, rather than convenient alliance. Edmund had done neither. He had simply accepted the arrangement his advisors suggested, then decided to observe Clara from the shadows, rather than truly speaking with her, asking her questions, learning what she wanted from her own voice, rather than through careful spying. He picked the tray back up, his movements mechanical, and knocked softly on the door, as he had been instructed. When Clara called for him to enter, he stepped inside with his eyes carefully lowered, placing the wine on the side table exactly as Foley had directed, though every part of him wanted to look up, to search Clara's face for some sign of the vulnerability he had just overheard. "Thank you," Clara said quietly, and Edmund caught only a brief glimpse of her expression as he straightened, enough to see that her eyes were slightly red, though she held herself with careful composure in front of a servant she barely knew. He bowed and left the room, closing the door softly behind him, and stood for a moment in the empty hallway, his heart pounding with a mixture of shame and clarity he had never experienced before. Somewhere above him, candlelight flickered beneath other doors, and somewhere beyond the walls of Bennet Manor, his own household waited for news of his supposed formal arrival, still days away. But the man who walked back toward the servants' quarters that night was not the same man who had arrived in disguise 4 days earlier. He no longer wondered simply whether Clara would make a suitable duchess. He wondered, with growing urgency, whether he could become the kind of husband she actually deserved, a man who listened, who noticed, who saw her fully rather than simply claiming her as an arrangement fulfilled. And he wondered, with equal urgency, how he could possibly reveal his true identity now, knowing what he knew, without confirming every fear she had just confessed to her aunt in what she believed was complete privacy. Sleep did not come easily that night. Edmund lay awake long after the other footmen had fallen silent, replaying Clara's words over and over, turning them like stones in his hands, searching for some path forward that did not involve either continued deception or devastating exposure. He thought of Grayson Vale's calculating eyes, of Lord Bennet's casual assumption that his daughter's feelings mattered little compared to a profitable arrangement, of Clara's quiet courage in admitting, even in private, that she wanted more than her mother had ever received. By the time gray morning light began creeping through the small window above his cot, Edmund had made a decision, though he was not yet certain how he would carry it out. He would not simply arrive as the Duke and pretend ignorance of everything he had witnessed. He would find a way to prove to Clara, through actions rather than titles, that he was capable of being the kind of man she hoped for, even if it meant risking everything, his reputation, his family's expectations, and quite possibly Clara's trust itself, once the truth of his deception finally came to light. What he did not yet know was that his time to act freely, hidden safely within his disguise, was rapidly running out. Grayson Vale had noticed the new footman's frequent presence near Lady Clara, and questions were already beginning to form in sharper, more dangerous minds than Edmund had anticipated. 2 days after the conversation Edmund had overheard, Grayson Vale returned to Bennet Manor unannounced, arriving just before midday with an expression far less friendly than his previous visits had shown. He requested a private word with Lord Bennet, and the two men disappeared into the study for nearly an hour, their voices occasionally rising loud enough for fragments to carry into the hallway, where Edmund happened to be arranging fresh flowers in a tall vase near the study door. "I am simply concerned for your daughter's reputation," Grayson was saying, his tone smooth but edged with something sharper beneath the surface. "A new footman, hired only days ago, has been seen near Lady Clara far more often than his duties would require. I noticed it myself during my last visit, and I have heard similar observations from others in the neighborhood who have called upon your household this week." Edmund's hands stilled on the flower stems. He forced himself to continue arranging them, though his pulse had quickened considerably. Lord Bennet's response carried genuine surprise. "A footman. I have hardly noticed the new staff, Grayson. We have taken on several extra hands in preparation for the Duke's arrival. Surely you are mistaken." "Perhaps," Grayson said, though his voice suggested he believed no such thing. "I only mention it out of concern. A duke arriving to find rumors already circulating about his intended bride would hardly begin the marriage on solid footing. Perhaps it would be wise to investigate the new hires more carefully before his visit." Edmund finished with the flowers and moved away from the study door, as quickly as dignity allowed, his mind racing. Grayson suspected something, though clearly not the full truth, and his suggestion that Lord Bennet investigate the new servants posed a serious threat to Edmund's disguise. If Lord Bennet began asking questions about his background, questions Edmund's hastily arranged position could not withstand under close examination, everything might unravel before he had found the right way to reveal himself. He found Peter later that afternoon, having arranged a brief meeting near the stable, where deliveries were sometimes received from the village. Peter's face showed immediate concern when Edmund explained what he had overheard. "This has gone too far," Peter said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were not observed. "You must end this disguise now, before Lord Bennet begins asking questions you cannot answer. If Grayson Vale suspects anything, and pushes hard enough, the scandal that follows will not simply embarrass you, it will damage Lady Clara's reputation as well, through no fault of her own." Edmund knew Peter spoke sense, yet something in him resisted ending the disguise so abruptly, without first finding some way to speak honestly with Clara, to begin building the foundation he hoped their marriage might rest upon. "2 more days," he said finally. "The Duke's arrival is already planned for 2 days from now. Let me use this remaining time carefully, and I promise I will end things properly before any real danger reaches Clara." Peter's expression remained troubled, but he nodded reluctantly, agreeing to wait, though he warned Edmund to remain especially cautious given Grayson's growing suspicions. That evening, an opportunity Edmund had not anticipated presented itself. Following a light supper, Clara announced her intention to walk in the garden before the evening grew too cool, and Foley, distracted by preparations for the following day's arrangements, instructed Edmund to accompany her at a respectful distance, carrying a lantern to light her path as the sun began to set. It was a common enough duty, yet Edmund's heart raced at the prospect of being near Clara again, even under such formal, distant circumstances. The garden stretched wide behind Bennet Manor, filled with carefully tended roses and winding stone paths that led toward the same old oak tree where Clara often read. She walked slowly this evening, her arms wrapped around herself against the cooling air, and Edmund followed several steps behind, lantern raised, saying nothing, as proper conduct required. They had nearly reached the oak tree when Clara suddenly stopped and turned toward him, her expression curious rather than suspicious. "You are the same footman who spoke with me here several days ago," she said. "Edmund Carow, I believe Mrs. Higgins called you." "Yes, my lady," Edmund answered, keeping his eyes respectfully lowered, though every instinct urged him to look directly at her. "You are quieter than most of the other staff," Clara continued, studying him with open curiosity. "Most footmen chatter among themselves constantly when they believe no one important is listening. You seem to prefer silence." "I find there is often more to learn in silence than in speech, my lady," Edmund said carefully, unable to resist offering at least a small piece of genuine thought. Clara's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly surprised by such a thoughtful answer from a servant. "That is an unusual philosophy for a footman." "Perhaps I am an unusual footman," Edmund replied, immediately regretting the words as soon as they left his mouth, fearing they revealed too much. But Clara only laughed softly, a genuine sound that eased some of the exhaustion Edmund had noticed weighing on her since his arrival. "Perhaps you are," she agreed, then turned back toward the path, resuming her walk. "Tell me, Edmund Caro, do you believe people can truly know each other quickly, or does real understanding require years of careful observation?" The question struck Edmund with unexpected force, given everything he had witnessed and overheard during his short time at Bennet Manor. "I believe," he said slowly, choosing his words with great care, "that some people reveal their true nature within moments, through small actions rather than grand speeches. How a person treats those who can offer them nothing in return often tells more truth than any conversation ever could." Clara stopped walking again, turning fully toward him this time, studying his face with an intensity that made Edmund's chest tighten with fear that she might somehow see through his disguise. "That is a wise observation," she said quietly. "Wiser than I expected from casual conversation in a garden." "I only speak what I have observed, my lady," Edmund answered, bowing his head to break her gaze before she could look too closely. They continued their walk in comfortable silence after that, Clara occasionally pointing out particular flowers she favored, explaining small details about the garden's history that her grandmother had once shared with her. Edmund listened carefully, memorizing every word, treasuring this small, unguarded conversation more than he would have believed possible only a week earlier. By the time they returned to the house, the sun had fully set, and Clara thanked him formally at the door before disappearing inside, leaving Edmund standing alone in the darkness, lantern still burning, heart pounding with feelings he could no longer deny or ignore. The following morning brought new complications. Grayson Vale arrived again, this time accompanied by two associates Edmund did not recognize, gentlemen introduced as friends visiting from a neighboring county. While the group took refreshments in the drawing room, Edmund overheard one of the visitors mention, quite casually, that he had seen a footman matching Edmund's description in the village several months earlier, working not as household staff, but attending a formal dinner alongside several well-known lords and ladies, though the man could not quite place where exactly he had witnessed this. Edmund's blood ran cold. He had indeed attended such a dinner, though not as a footman, and if this visitor's memory sharpened even slightly, the entire disguise could collapse within moments. He excused himself as quickly as proper conduct allowed, retreating toward the kitchen with his pulse hammering violently against his ribs. Foley intercepted him in the hallway, his sharp eyes studying Edmund with unusual scrutiny. "You look unwell, Caro. Is something troubling you?" "Only fatigue, sir," Edmund managed, forcing his voice into calm steadiness despite the panic clawing at his chest. "I have not slept well these past nights." Foley's expression remained skeptical, though he said nothing further, simply instructing Edmund to assist with preparations in the dining room for the midday meal. Edmund worked mechanically through the following hours, his mind racing through possible explanations, possible escapes, possible ways to protect both his disguise and Clara's reputation should the truth begin unraveling before he was ready to reveal it on his own terms. That afternoon, while carrying linens toward the upper floor, Edmund overheard Grayson speaking quietly with Lord Bennet once more, this time with even greater urgency in his voice. "I strongly suggest you dismiss the new footman before the Duke's arrival tomorrow," Grayson said. "My associate believes he recognized the man from a formal gathering months ago, attending not as staff, but as a guest of considerable standing. Something is not right here, Bennet, and I would hate to see your family's reputation damaged by whatever scheme this man may be involved in." Lord Bennet's voice carried genuine alarm now. "A guest, posing as a footman, in my own household, near my daughter. This is a serious accusation, Grayson. I will have Foley question the man immediately." Edmund's chest tightened painfully as he hurried away from the doorway, understanding with sudden clarity that his time had run out far sooner than he had planned. Foley would be sent to question him within the hour, and any lie he offered would likely collapse under careful scrutiny, especially now that suspicion had already been planted so firmly in Lord Bennet's mind. He needed to speak with Clara before the truth emerged through Foley's investigation, before Lord Bennet's anger and Grayson's satisfaction painted the story in whatever light served their own purposes. He needed her to hear the truth from him directly, however imperfect the timing, however risky the confession. He found her in the library, alone, reading near the tall windows that overlooked the front drive. She looked up in mild surprise as he entered without knocking, an unusual breach of proper conduct that immediately signaled something was wrong. "My lady," Edmund said quietly, closing the door behind him, despite knowing such an action alone could be considered deeply improper. "I must speak with you honestly, and I fear I have very little time before others force this conversation to happen under far worse circumstances." Clara set down her book, her expression shifting from surprise to genuine concern. "Edmund, what is happening? You seem frightened." "I am not who you believe me to be," Edmund said, his voice trembling slightly despite his effort to remain steady. "I am not truly a footman, my lady. My name is not Caro. I came to this house in disguise, hoping to learn who you truly were before our formal introduction took place, because I could not bear the thought of meeting yet another young woman who showed me only polished performance rather than genuine truth." Clara rose slowly from her chair, her face pale with dawning understanding, though disbelief still colored her expression. "What are you saying?" "I am the Duke," Edmund said finally, the words feeling both terrifying and strangely freeing as they left his mouth. "Edmund Halden. I arrived days ago disguised as a footman, and I have spent this time observing your household, your kindness toward those who serve you, your courage, your honesty, all without your knowledge or consent. I know this was wrong. I know I owed you the truth from the very first moment, but I could not stop myself from wanting to know you as you truly are, rather than as you might present yourself to a man you knew held power over your future." Clara's hand rose slowly to cover her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock, betrayal, and something else Edmund could not quite identify. "You have been watching me," she whispered. "All this time, every conversation, every private moment, you were not simply a servant, you were judging me, testing me, without my knowledge." "That was never my intention," Edmund said quickly, desperate to make her understand. "I only wanted honesty, and I did not know how else to find it. I never meant to cause you pain." But before Clara could respond, before Edmund could explain further, or beg her understanding, the library door swung open sharply, and Foley entered, with Lord Bennet close behind him, both men's expressions grim with suspicion and barely contained anger. "There you are, Caro," Foley said sharply, then paused, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene before him. Edmund standing far too close to Lady Clara, both of them clearly caught in the middle of some private, unauthorized conversation. Lord Bennet's face darkened dangerously. "What is the meaning of this? Clara, step away from that man immediately." Clara did not move, her eyes still fixed on Edmund, searching his face for something, though Edmund could not tell whether she searched for confirmation of deception or some remaining trace of the honesty he had just confessed. The silence stretched unbearably long, filled with the weight of secrets about to be exposed to an audience far less forgiving than the private conversation Edmund had hoped to have. "Father," Clara said finally, her voice steadier than Edmund expected, though it trembled slightly at the edges, "there is something you need to know about this footman." Edmund's heart stopped, uncertain whether Clara's next words would protect him or condemn him entirely, uncertain whether the trust he had hoped to build through honesty had already crumbled beyond repair in the very moment he had finally offered her the truth. "He is not who he claims to be," Clara said slowly, her eyes never leaving Edmund's face. "He told me only moments ago, this man is not a footman at all." Lord Bennet's face flushed with rage, and Foley took a threatening step forward, clearly prepared to seize Edmund by the collar and drag him from the house without further ceremony. "I knew it," Foley muttered darkly. "I knew there was something wrong about you from the very first day." "Wait," Clara said sharply, raising her hand, and something in her tone carried enough authority that both men paused, waiting for her to continue. "Before you do anything rash, you should know exactly who stands before you." Edmund watched her carefully, unable to predict which direction her next words might take. His future, and quite possibly his family's reputation, balanced precariously on whatever she chose to reveal. "This is Duke Edmund Halden," Clara said finally, her voice clear and steady despite the storm of emotion Edmund could see still swirling behind her eyes. "He arrived in disguise, posing as a footman, in order to observe our household before his formal arrival tomorrow." The silence that followed was absolute. Lord Bennet's face shifted rapidly through several expressions, anger giving way to confusion, confusion giving way to something approaching horror as the full implications settled upon him. Foley's hand, which had been reaching toward Edmund's collar, dropped slowly to his side, his weathered face pale with sudden understanding of exactly how close he had come to physically manhandling a duke. "Your Grace," Lord Bennet stammered, his voice barely recognizable as the confident tone he had used moments earlier. "Forgive me. I did not know. I could not have known. This is most unusual, most unexpected." Edmund straightened his shoulders, abandoning entirely the humble posture he had maintained for days, allowing his true bearing to emerge for the first time within these walls. "I owe you an apology, Lord Bennet, not an explanation demanded under threat, but an apology freely given. I arrived in disguise because I wished to know your daughter honestly, before the formalities of our arranged marriage could color how she presented herself to me. It was, I now recognize, a poorly conceived plan that has caused genuine distress, and for that, I am truly sorry." Lord Bennet seemed momentarily speechless, clearly torn between anger at the deception and relief that the mysterious footman, causing him such worry, was in fact the very duke he had hoped to welcome the following day. "Your Grace," he said finally, gathering himself with visible effort, "perhaps we should discuss this matter privately, away from the servants' quarters, in a manner befitting your true station." "I would prefer," Edmund said firmly, "that we first allow Lady Clara the opportunity to speak freely about how this situation has affected her. She has been wronged by my deception far more than either of us, and her feelings deserve consideration before we discuss anything else." Clara's eyes widened slightly at this, clearly not expecting Edmund, now revealed as the powerful duke her family had hoped to please, to prioritize her feelings over practical arrangements. Lord Bennet looked equally surprised, glancing between his daughter and the duke with an expression suggesting he was rapidly recalculating his understanding of the entire situation. "Foley, perhaps you would give us a moment," Lord Bennet said finally, and the butler withdrew from the room with visible reluctance, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Edmund, Clara, and her father alone in the tense quiet of the library. "Clara," Lord Bennet began carefully, though his daughter interrupted him before he could continue. "I would like to speak with the Duke alone, Father," she said, her voice firm despite the slight tremor Edmund could still detect beneath the surface. "If that is acceptable to him." Lord Bennet hesitated, clearly uncertain whether such an arrangement was proper, but Edmund nodded his agreement immediately, and after a long moment of visible internal struggle, Lord Bennet withdrew as well, leaving the door slightly open behind him, a small concession to propriety, even as he granted his daughter's unusual request. When they were finally alone, Clara turned to face Edmund fully, her expression a complicated mixture of hurt, confusion, and something that might have been cautious curiosity struggling beneath the anger she clearly still felt. "You heard something," she said quietly. "That night, when you brought the wine to the sitting room, you heard my conversation with my aunt." Edmund did not attempt to deny it, understanding that any further deception, however small, would destroy whatever fragile trust remained possible between them. "Yes," he admitted, "I heard everything. I heard your fears about becoming invisible within your own marriage, about disappearing the way you believe your mother has disappeared within hers. I heard what you truly want from a husband, and I have thought of little else since that night." Clara's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and she turned partially away from him, her arms wrapping around herself in a protective gesture Edmund recognized from their walk in the garden. "That was a private conversation," she said, her voice tight, "meant for my aunt alone, not for a stranger listening at the door, and certainly not for the very man those fears concerned most directly." "I know," Edmund said, stepping closer, though he stopped himself before closing the distance completely, respecting the space she clearly needed. "I have felt the weight of that violation every moment since. But I cannot honestly say I regret hearing your words, Clara, because they changed something fundamental in how I understand what marriage means, and what I owe you as a husband, should you still consider proceeding with our arrangement after everything that has happened." Clara turned back toward him slowly, studying his face with the same intensity she had shown during their garden conversation, though now that intensity carried far greater weight, given everything that had been revealed between them. "And what do you believe you owe me now?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Edmund took a careful breath before answering, wanting his words to carry the full weight of everything he had learned during his days in disguise. I owe you honesty, always, even when honesty is difficult or inconvenient. I owe you genuine interest in your thoughts and opinions, not polite agreement, offered simply to avoid conflict. I owe you the freedom to remain fully yourself within our marriage, rather than expecting you to shrink into whatever shape convenience demands. I watched you these past days, Clara, not simply to judge whether you would make a suitable duchess, but because I found myself genuinely admiring the person you are when you believe no one important is watching. Your kindness toward those who serve you. Your quiet courage in facing a future largely decided without your input. Your honesty, even when honesty costs you something. These are not qualities I wish to diminish through marriage. These are qualities I wish to help protect and celebrate. Clara was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and Edmund waited with his heart pounding, uncertain whether his words had reached her, or simply added another layer of complication to an already devastating betrayal of trust. That is a beautiful speech, Clara said finally, though her tone carried more caution than warmth. But you must understand, Your Grace, that beautiful words mean very little after such deception. You did not simply observe me from a respectful distance. You lived within my household under false pretenses, watched private moments never intended for your eyes, listened to conversations meant to remain confidential. However noble your intentions may have been, the method you chose was a violation of my privacy and my trust, and I cannot simply set that aside because your words now sound sincere. You are right to feel this way, Edmund said, accepting her words without argument, understanding that defending his methods further would only compound the damage already done. I cannot undo what has happened, and I will not insult you by pretending my actions were justified simply because my intentions were good. All I can offer now is my continued honesty moving forward, and my genuine willingness to earn back whatever trust I have damaged, however long that process might require. Clara studied him for another long moment, then finally spoke words that surprised Edmund considerably. And what of the arranged marriage itself? She asked. Given everything that has happened, do you still wish to proceed, or has this experience changed your mind about our suitability as husband and wife? Edmund answered without hesitation, the certainty in his own heart surprising even himself. I wish to proceed, Clara, though only if you wish the same, and only with the understanding that whatever marriage we build together must be built on genuine partnership, not simply the convenient arrangement our families originally intended. I do not want a wife who performs contentment for the sake of appearances. I want a partner who speaks honestly, even when honesty is uncomfortable, just as you did with your aunt, just as you have done with me, in this very conversation. Clara's expression softened slightly, though wariness remained clearly visible beneath the surface. I need time, she said finally. Time to consider whether trust can genuinely be rebuilt after such a beginning, and time to understand my own feelings about a man who deceived me, even while claiming to seek honesty above all else. That is entirely fair, Edmund said, relief flooding through him despite the uncertainty her words still carried. Relief simply that she had not rejected him outright, that some small possibility remained for the future he had begun to hope for during his days in disguise. I will not press you for more than you are willing to offer, but I would ask one thing, if you are willing to grant it. What is that? Clara asked, her curiosity clearly returning despite her guarded composure. Allow me to properly court you, Edmund said, as myself this time, honestly and openly, without disguise or deception of any kind. Let me prove through my actions, over whatever time you need, that the man who spoke those words to you moments ago is genuine, rather than simply another performance offered in a moment of crisis. Clara considered this for a long moment, before finally nodding, a small, cautious gesture that nonetheless filled Edmund with hope. I will consider it, she said, but you must understand, Your Grace, that I will be watching you as carefully as you once watched me, and I will not easily forget the lesson this experience has taught me about the distance between appearance and truth. I would expect nothing less, Edmund said, and for the first time since his identity had been revealed, he saw something that might have been the faint beginning of a genuine smile touch the corners of Clara's mouth, quickly suppressed, but not entirely hidden. Their conversation was interrupted moments later by a soft knock at the door, Lord Bennet returning with visible anxiety, clearly eager to understand what arrangements had been reached and how he should proceed with preparations for what was now, awkwardly, both an already occurring visit and a formal arrival still officially scheduled for the following day. As Edmund stepped from the library, finally free of his footman disguise, finally able to walk through Bennet Manor as himself, he understood that the true test of everything he had learned during his days in hiding was only beginning. Winning back Clara's trust would require far more than beautiful words spoken in a single dramatic conversation. It would require patience, consistency, and a willingness to prove through daily actions that he was capable of becoming the kind of husband she had described to her aunt. A man who listened, who noticed, who saw her fully, rather than simply claiming her as an arrangement fulfilled. Outside the library window, evening light was beginning to fade across the garden where he and Clara had walked together only the night before, and Edmund found himself already planning how he might begin the long, careful work of earning honestly what he had previously only observed in secret. News of the Duke's true identity spread through Bennet Manor within hours, though Lord Bennet insisted the full details of the deception remain carefully guarded, fearing scandal should word reach beyond the household walls. The servants who had worked alongside Edmund during his days in disguise reacted with a mixture of astonishment and quiet amusement, Mrs. Higgins in particular, declaring loudly that she had always suspected something unusual about a footman who spoke with such careful grammar and carried himself with such unconscious authority, even while hauling firewood. Foley, for his part, approached Edmund the following morning with visible discomfort, offering a formal apology for having spoken so sharply to him during his time as a supposed servant. Edmund waved the apology away immediately, insisting that Foley had done nothing wrong, that the fault belonged entirely to Edmund himself for creating a situation where such confusion could occur in the first place. This response, delivered with genuine warmth rather than condescension, seemed to ease much of the tension among the household staff, who gradually began treating the revelation as an unusual story to share, rather than a source of ongoing awkwardness. Clara, however, remained more difficult to read. Over the following days, as Edmund settled into Bennet Manor as himself, formally received and properly announced according to every rule of propriety, he found her polite but reserved, willing to speak with him during arranged visits, but careful to maintain emotional distance, testing his patience and consistency exactly as she had promised. Edmund did not press her. Instead, he focused on demonstrating through small, consistent actions the kind of husband he had promised to become. He asked her opinion on matters large and small, then genuinely listened to her answers, sometimes changing his own thinking based on what she offered, rather than simply nodding politely before proceeding as originally planned. He noticed when she seemed tired or troubled, gently asking, rather than ignoring, giving her space to share or decline as she preferred. He spoke with her about books she loved, discovered her genuine passion for horses that her needlework lessons had always suppressed, and arranged, much to her surprised delight, for a skilled riding instructor to visit Bennet Manor twice weekly, not as a grand romantic gesture, but simply because he had listened when she mentioned missing the freedom of riding freely across open fields. Slowly, cautiously, something began shifting between them. But not everyone within the county welcomed this developing understanding. Grayson Vale, having watched his hopes for Clara's hand crumble entirely once the true identity of the mysterious footman was revealed, grew increasingly desperate as the wedding preparations progressed. His family's financial troubles, which Edmund had learned about from Lord Bennet's earlier conversation, had apparently worsened considerably, and Grayson's need for a profitable marriage had grown correspondingly urgent. Nearly 2 weeks after Edmund's true identity had been revealed, during a formal dinner held at Bennet Manor to celebrate the upcoming marriage, Grayson arrived uninvited, his expression carrying none of his usual smooth charm, replaced instead by something colder and more desperate. "Your Grace," Grayson said, interrupting the pleasant conversation flowing around the dinner table with deliberate rudeness. "I wonder if your bride has told you everything about her time spent unknowingly in the company of a man pretending to be a servant. I wonder if she has mentioned how many private moments you observed without her knowledge or consent, moments that, should certain details become known throughout the county, might raise serious questions about propriety on both sides of this arrangement." The table fell into stunned silence, Lord Bennet's face flushed with anger, and Clara's hand, which had been resting near her wine-glass, tightened visibly, though her expression remained carefully composed, despite the obvious threat contained within Grayson's words. Edmund rose slowly from his seat, his voice remaining calm despite the anger building beneath his controlled exterior. "Lord Grayson, whatever concerns you carry regarding propriety, I would suggest addressing them privately, rather than attempting to embarrass Lady Clara publicly at her own family's table. I have already acknowledged openly, to Lord Bennet and to Clara herself, exactly what occurred during my time in disguise, and I have taken full responsibility for the poor judgment that decision represented. There is nothing hidden here that requires your intervention to expose." "Perhaps not hidden from your immediate family," Grayson said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, "but the wider county has heard only fragments of rumor, and rumors, left uncorrected, tend to grow far more scandalous than the truth itself. I wonder how many respectable families might reconsider their opinion of Lady Clara once they learn a strange man lived among her household staff for nearly a week, observing her most private moments without her knowledge." Clara rose from her seat then, her composure remarkable given the pointed cruelty of Grayson's implications, and Edmund watched with growing admiration as she addressed the man directly, her voice clear and unwavering. "Lord Grayson," she said, "you seem to believe that spreading rumors about my reputation will somehow benefit your own position, though I confess I struggle to understand exactly what you hope to gain. If you intend to suggest impropriety occurred between myself and the Duke during his time in disguise, I would remind you that every servant in this household can confirm his conduct remained entirely proper throughout, respectful and appropriate in every interaction we shared. If you intend simply to damage my reputation out of bitterness over your own failed ambitions regarding my hand, I would suggest such behavior reflects far more poorly upon your own character than anything you hope to expose about mine." Grayson's face darkened considerably at this direct challenge, clearly not expecting such firm resistance from a young woman he had perhaps assumed would remain quietly embarrassed by his accusations. "I only speak the truth," he said stiffly, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "You speak whatever serves your own interests," Clara replied, her voice steady and unafraid. "And I believe everyone at this table understands that distinction quite clearly." Lord Bennet, finding his voice at last, rose from his own seat with visible fury. "Grayson, you have overstepped considerably by arriving uninvited and attempting to embarrass my daughter and her intended husband within my own home. I must ask you to leave immediately, and I would strongly advise reconsidering any further attempts to spread damaging rumors, given that such actions could easily result in serious consequences for your own family's already precarious standing within this county." Grayson's eyes flickered between Lord Bennet's anger, Edmund's controlled but clearly formidable presence, and Clara's unwavering composure, and something in his expression suggested he was rapidly recalculating whether his desperate gamble had been wise. Without further words, he turned and left the dining room, his footsteps echoing sharply through the hallway before the front door closed firmly behind him. The table remained silent for several long moments after his departure, until Aunt Margaret, who had witnessed the entire confrontation with visible interest, finally spoke, breaking the tension with characteristic directness. "Well," she said, "that was certainly more dramatic than most dinner conversations I have attended recently." A ripple of nervous laughter passed around the table, easing some of the lingering tension, and Edmund found himself catching Clara's eye across the table, sharing a brief moment of genuine connection amid the chaos Grayson had attempted to create. She offered him a small, tired smile, and something about that simple gesture, offered freely rather than performed for propriety's sake, told Edmund that perhaps his patient efforts over the past weeks had begun accomplishing exactly what he hoped. In the days following Grayson's failed attempt at intimidation, word did spread through the county regarding the confrontation, though not in the direction Grayson had intended. Rather than damaging Clara's reputation, the story that circulated painted her as remarkably composed and dignified under pressure, while Grayson himself became the subject of considerable disapproval for his desperate and ungentlemanly behavior. Within a month, facing mounting social consequences alongside his existing financial troubles, Grayson departed the county entirely, relocating to distant relatives in the north, and Edmund heard no further trouble from that direction. More importantly, The confrontation seemed to shift something significant in Clara's guarded heart. Where she had previously maintained careful distance during Edmund's visits, she began engaging more openly, sharing her genuine opinions without hesitation, asking him questions about his own life and background, with real curiosity, rather than polite obligation. She told him, during one particularly memorable afternoon in the garden, about her fear of becoming invisible within marriage, the same fear she had confessed to her aunt weeks earlier, though this time she spoke the words directly to Edmund himself, testing whether he would truly listen as he had promised. "I hear you," Edmund said simply, when she finished speaking, "and I will not let that fear become reality. I promise you, Clara, whatever partnership we build together, it will be one where your voice matters as much as mine, where your interests and passions receive the same respect and attention as any decision affecting our household or our future." Clara studied him carefully, the same searching look she had given him during their very first conversation in this garden, though now that searching look carried warmth rather than simple curiosity. "I believe you," she said finally, quietly, and something in Edmund's chest loosened with relief and joy he had not fully realized he was holding until that moment. Their wedding took place 3 months later, on a bright autumn morning, with clear skies stretching endlessly overhead, surrounded by family and friends from throughout the county, including many of the very servants who had worked alongside Edmund during his brief, unusual time as a footman. Mrs. Higgins wept openly during the ceremony, declaring loudly to anyone nearby that she had personally witnessed true love developing right beneath her own kitchen roof, though she had certainly never expected such an unusual beginning to their story. As Edmund and Clara exchanged their vows before the assembled guests, Edmund found himself thinking back to that first uncertain night, arriving at the servant gate disguised in rough wool, uncertain whether his plan represented wisdom or foolishness. He understood now, standing before Clara as her husband rather than her secret observer, that the answer had always been both. The deception had been foolish, had caused genuine pain, and required considerable effort to repair. But the desire beneath that foolish plan, the genuine wish to know Clara honestly, rather than through polished performance alone, had led him toward a truth far more valuable than anything a formal, properly conducted courtship might have revealed. Their marriage, built ultimately upon honesty freely offered rather than deception carefully maintained, grew into exactly the partnership Clara had once described to her aunt, in what she believed was complete privacy. Edmund continued asking her opinion on matters throughout their household and beyond, genuinely valuing her perspective on everything from managing their tenant farms to decisions affecting their growing family in later years. Clara, in turn, found herself gradually trusting more fully, sharing her thoughts and feelings without the careful guardedness that had once protected her from the very disappointment she had feared inheriting from her own mother's marriage. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had first met, Clara would smile and tell them the story of a footman who arrived at their grandfather's house, carrying firewood and speaking with unusually careful grammar, a footman who turned out, quite unexpectedly, to be a duke seeking truth rather than convenient arrangement. And Edmund, listening to her tell the story with genuine warmth rather than lingering bitterness, understood that whatever mistakes had marked the beginning of their journey together, they had ultimately built something rare and precious between them. A marriage founded on honesty, mutual respect, and the simple, powerful truth that Clara had once whispered to her aunt in a quiet sitting room, believing no one important was listening at all.